Toyota, I love what you do for me. Chevrolet, because the heart of America is winning. Michelin, because so much is riding on your tires. The writing on the walls of our culture point unmistakably to the presence of the car in our lives. A heap of metal on four wheels, it may be. A clever and convenient way of getting from A to B, perhaps. But in advertising, in popular songs, and in the public imagination, it's a whole lot more. Is it also one of those signs of the times which the followers of Jesus are called upon to identify and interpret?
What if you could choose any car in the world and price was no object? Your heart's desire, just for the asking.
We are married to the automobile. It is an essential part of American life. And the kids grow up, they can hardly wait until they get a driver's license. That's a sign that they have grown up, a sign of manhood for young people.
Few things have influenced American society as profoundly as the car. And Professor Melvin Kranzberg, who's an expert on the history of technology, has spent his life studying its impact on the culture.
Well, the car has many fascinations for me. For one thing, it is an icon of American life. An icon, if you look at the original definition, it came from Greece, from Greek, and it was a representation of a sacred person or image. But now we have what are called popular icons, where the people worship and adore, love something, and the automobile is an example of that. And there are certain activities involved with automobiles, not only driving them, etc., but also their impact upon manufacturing, upon our way of life, where we live, how we work, think, play, and pray.
Well, you know how anything therapeutic is. You only feel better when you pay for it. It's your money.
We're a creator. That's the soul of Audi.
Having a car, it gives us a sense of power. We can drive to where we want to go and move to where we want to live. We don't have to stay in one place as most people did throughout the world. Generations born and grew up and lived in the same place. Now you can move, and from a kid, you don't go to school right around the corner. A school bus comes and takes you to a special school farther away, where your education can be enlarged, because you're no longer confined to one little neighborhood. And so this sense of power given us by the automobile is something that we Americans take for granted, but it's not something that has existed in history in other civilizations.
But while mobility itself certainly is prized in American society, the style in which we travel has also become ever more important. Henley McGee is a salesman of top-of-the-range automobiles in Roswell, Georgia.
Cars are important to Americans. We spend a lot of time on the road, and whether we like it or not, cars say something about us. If you see a man riding up in a limousine, it makes a statement. You see a fellow driving an old beat-up piece of junk, it makes a statement. You see a woman with blonde hair driving down the street in a convertible and her tennis bracelet on her arm, that's a statement. And what we try to do is create the correct statement that we feel embodies our being or the way we want to be perceived. So the advertising and the people selling automobiles cater to that. We want the car to represent the statement of who we are. And if that statement is, look at me in the convertible with the fancy wheels and the outstanding paint job, and I have a color-coordinated pinstripe, then if that's how we want the world to see us, we have the flexibility and the opportunity to do so.
The automobile makes possible the democratization of American society, because the person driving the cheap little car can get to the same place as a person driving the Rolls-Royce.
Averaging 350 miles a day on 6-lane roads, 1-lane roads, and all the roads in between. The Abbey stopped only to eat, sleep, and have a son, Robert. Later, a daughter, Catherine.
can share the same roads, we can go to the same places, enjoy the same entertainments, and I think it explains why the automobile is an icon. We've built our lives around the automobile, and we can't think of being without one.
Yes, automobiles do represent freedom. That's part of our whole highway system, and having the highway can take you anywhere. And the highway's no good unless you've got an automobile. So instead of selling the transportation side of it, advertisers try to sell the freedom to go anywhere. Convertibles are back. Cadillac advertised in 1976, the last of the American convertibles. Now they're back with convertibles. Americans wanted that extra feeling of freedom. The import cars have zeroed in on the freedom with T-tops. Fuel economy and reliability were not enough. They wanted excitement, pizzazz, just like the car that I'm in.
But how real is this promise of freedom held out by the car? Luke Johnson is Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins in Candler School of Theology at Emory University.
When I try to think about the automobile in theological terms, the category I find most useful is that of idolatry, which, as you will recall, in terms of the biblical analysis of idolatry, does not mean simply the worship of a false god, but rather the disposition of human freedom in a flawed way, so that choices are made which are distortive of creation as God has created the world, and usually under the illusion that this choice will give humans more freedom. And what results by the law of unintended consequence is that idolatry always ends up with a certain kind of enslavement. And it seems to me that the automobile wonderfully illustrates that in terms of what has happened in our culture. Clearly, the development of the automobile reflected perfectly the sort of Promethean assumption that if we can do something, we ought to do something. It was technology advancing to the disregard of virtually anything else. If you remember, the petroleum industry before the automobile was basically concerned with finding fuel for lamps. And it was an illumination industry. With the automobile, the petroleum industry became geared toward this ever-proliferating opportunity for humans to be wherever they wanted to be, on their own terms, whenever they wanted to be. So the move was toward the purest individualism, the finest expression of the American ideal, to be any damn thing that one wanted. And devil take the hindmost, which in fact, of course, it did. Because what the hindmost turned out to be, of course, was an entire world economy geared toward the production of fuel. So that having the resources of petroleum was a major influence in all of the wars fought in this century. It has been the most decisive factor in the pollution of creation. And so even if we got our freedom by means of the automobile and expressed our freedom, one has to question whether creation itself has not been utterly distorted as a result of that. This automobile graveyard is simply the most graphic example of the sort of desolation that the automobile has left in its wake. But has it really freed those it was intended to free? I mean, the automobile moved from what was in effect a form of entertainment, a form of being able to visit the folks or to get from one place to the other more rapidly, into this machine around which our culture has been built. The gutting of inner cities, the building of superhighways, the elimination of railroads, the elimination of other forms of mass transit, have in effect created a generation of people who are enslaved by the very instrument that they devise to ensure their freedom. So that one of the greatest tragedies of idolatry is that it ends up enslaving the very ones to whom it offered freedom. And I think the automobile is a wonderful example because we now cannot really escape it easily.
with standard electronic dual airbags, side impact beams, and available 4-channel...
The letter of James in chapter 5, verses 1 following, attacks the rich who have lived oppressively on the earth. And he uses such a striking image that their wealth will rust. And that rust will be testimony against them. And the rust will eat their very flesh. And what we have here, of course, is this appalling ulcer that eats our flesh as a society, because, in effect, it is a testimony of our wealth that has been misspent, and it continues to eat at us because we really can't get rid of it. It's not alive. It's dead. But it's a life that never was and a death that won't go away.
An apocalyptic note there from Luke Johnson, contrasting sharply with the enthusiasm of Melvin Kranzberg and Henry McGee. It's an idol that enslaves us, says Johnson. No, say the others, it's a valued part of who we are. It's a central part of American freedom and democracy. Well, with me to discuss the meaning of the automobile in American society are two members of the faculty here at Columbia. Rick Dietrich is director of the Lay Institute, and Stan Saunders is a professor of New Testament. Rick, what do you drive?
I drive a 1984 Nissan Stanza that I bought from my father last year for $1,000.
A classic of its type?
Hardly a classic. It's an ugly little car, but it works. It has about 100,000 miles on it, still runs. I expect to get another 100,000 out of it.
Does it matter to you what you drive?
I think it does. I'd feel uncomfortable driving a flashy car. I'd feel uncomfortable driving a Cadillac. In fact, I own, my parents-in-law own a large Oldsmobile, which we have driven from time to time. And when I was a minister in Gainesville, Florida, I felt very uncomfortable driving that, especially to the hospital. It made me feel more than uncomfortable to drive it and park it in the clergy parking place, this long 20-foot luxury car.
Stan, I've seen a flashy car pulling into the car park here a few times. I think that's yours, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, we made the move into the mainstream of American culture last year when we bought a new Infiniti G20, which is black and sleek and sporty.
Now, did you take a lot of care about what you bought?
Probably not enough. For example, I thought this car fit me, but the day after I got it home, the first thing I did after I got into the car was to notice that I didn't have enough headroom, so I had to start tilting the seat way back. And that was simply because when we had tested the car, it was later in the day, and so I was shorter.
Does it matter to you what you drive?
I think so, although I've driven a lot of different kinds of vehicles through the years, and basically I try to remind myself as much as possible that this is a utilitarian form of transportation and not much more than that. But it's awfully hard to get away from the sense that it does have something to do with one's image, and I think you feel differently depending upon the car that you're in. Luke Johnson spoke about the idolatry of the car in our culture. That seems to be a very odd thing to say. We all drive them. I mean, every one of us, almost without exception. You can't get by in America without a car. Can we really seriously say that cars are, in a sense, our idol, Rick?
Well, I think Luke Johnson makes a good case for that. I'd like to suggest that there's something beyond that, however. I don't think it's the automobile itself that is the idol. The automobile is an icon of an idol. I think that the idol is freedom. The automobile has come to represent freedom for us. We're a country that has always been on the move. And being on the move is a way for us to be free. I mean, that's an essential part of our culture. Look at what may be the great novel of the 19th century, for example, Huckleberry Finn. Huck Finn and Jim are free as long as they're on the move. In this case, they're not in an automobile, they're on the river. They become enslaved the moment they step off the river, off their raft, and onto dry land. In fact, they become enmeshed in all kinds of imponderable, complex, and insoluble situations. Jim himself becomes literally enslaved when they get to Arkansas and they get off the raft and onto the land. As long as they're on the move, they're free. As long as they're on the river, they're free. The moment they step on the land, they're enslaved. Jack Kerouac picks this up in an interesting way in his novel, On the Road. That's almost American cliche now. As long as the characters are on the road, they're free. But when they stop moving, they're no longer free. They're enslaved.
So you're saying that the idol is freedom understood in a particular way. Now, what way is that? I mean, the Christian gospel talks about freedom a great deal. What sense is this value, this understanding of freedom different?
I'd say it's a freedom from responsibility. Come back to the image we had of the car earlier as something that encapsulates someone, something that protects someone from the outside world. We express our individuality to ourselves and to others, and it's not just in relation to others, as Stan says, but out of relationship with others. You know, this is a freedom that is entirely individual, and in fact, a freedom that cuts us off from the world at large.
Do you agree with Rick that freedom is the main idea underlying this kind of icon of the car?
Oh, I think it's very much a part of it. I think it's also a false freedom that needs to be said. And part of what perhaps we need to come back to is the issue of how a Christian looks at the idea of freedom differently than say the typical American might. But I do think that in this culture, in this country, freedom is very closely connected in most people's minds with individualism. That's why it's important that we drive cars often by ourselves and we attempt to shut ourselves off in our cars from the rest of the world. And also our cars become an extension of our identity, kind of like the next layer of clothing that we put on, which makes in some ways more powerful statements about ourselves and our sense of identity than even the actual clothing on our body in some ways. But what's striking to me is that, in fact, I think Johnson is right that this pursuit of freedom through this particular form of individualism, this need to have a car, and to be free from any sort of encumbrance, to be able to go any place I want to, any time I want to, by myself or with other people, but to have that freedom of choice is very much tied up to the American sense that freedom consists of my capacity to do anything I want to, anytime I want to, regardless of anybody else around me. In fact, I think that's a false freedom. I think that is a form of slavery.
Well, how do you see that contrasting then with some of the great New Testament passages about freedom? And St. Paul talks a great deal about freedom from sin and freedom from the kind of the death that hangs over the world. How do you understand that differently to that individualistic idea of freedom?
Well, what Paul seems to be dealing with in many of those passages is the sense that folks shape an identity in competition with each other. So for people in Paul's day, shaping one's identity and being an honorable member of the Jewish community or of the Roman society more generally had to do with how you dressed, how you displayed your wealth ostentatiously, if at all possible, how you abused other people, in fact, as an expression of your status vis-a-vis these other folks that you're abusing. And what Paul, I think understands about that kind of behavior, that expression of freedom in that culture, is that, in fact, it is an attempt to flee our sense of alienation, of aloneness. It's a way of telling ourselves somehow that we're okay, that even if everything around us is very threatening, if it's a very chaotic context in which we live, if life on the streets is threatening to us still, we're okay because we're a person of honor and status and esteem. And I think the same thing is happening in American culture in various ways. I think that the car is just one expression of this, but our sense of freedom tied to this car becomes another expression of our being okay. If I drive an Infiniti, I must be a successful American person, so I must be okay. I can begin to relax a little bit. I only have to worry about those who are driving better Infinitis or a Lexus or something of that sort. Those are the people that now I have to worry about competing with. But you see, all that sets us at odds with each other. And instead of building a human community, we're competing for what we understand as a limited good, freedom. And so if Rick has too much freedom, that may somehow impinge upon my freedom. So we end up competing for freedom. Mm-hmm. And that becomes, instead of something that in fact frees us or that builds the human community, it in fact becomes something that ruptures.
Rick?
I agree with Stan. I see that Christian freedom is a freedom within a community, a freedom to be part of a community, a freedom to be part of the body of Jesus Christ. And the automobile frequently represents a freedom that is entirely individual and apart from any community. It's a significant family story for us that my wife Robin's father sold his car to get married. Had a beautiful Cord convertible, a wonderful status car, a wonderful freedom car, a car that represented all that singleness and the good life could represent in the late 1940s. And he chose to sell his car in order to have enough money to get married. That's a significant family story for us, I think, because it tells us something about Christian freedom, which is a freedom that chooses to be related to someone else rather than a freedom that chooses to go its own way.
And especially to be in a relationship with Jesus Christ, which Paul understands as the contrast to this false freedom that people in his culture and people in our culture are pursuing. I think Paul and many of the other early Christian authors had a very powerful sense that to really be free meant to be free from our false attachments to false ways of construing our identity, our clothing, our cars, the houses in which we live, our sense of status at the expense of other folks. Instead, to be truly free and to be fully a human being meant instead to shape our identity in a relationship with God, and particularly with Jesus Christ for Christians. And that freed us from being enslaved to these other false attachments, these false idols, these false ways of construing identity and freedom, which our culture is constantly trying to tell us are the ways to become free and fully human.
Jesus, right at the beginning of his ministry, stood up in the synagogue in Nazareth and said that he'd come to proclaim good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, liberty to the captives. What do you think that Christian freedom actually looks like in our day? In what sense can Jesus set us free from these attachments of ours?
Well, a way I've learned to talk about that is to talk about it in terms of not having to worry about competing with each other for all the things that we think that are good in life that in fact we also think are limited, like our morality. I think people fight over that because they seem to think that only so many of us can be good people. And in order to be good, I have to have other people I can identify as bad people. So we fight over moral issues. But it's also, again, a matter of shaping identity in very practical day-to-day ways that take us away from this need to have everything that our neighbor has in order to be acceptable. We can renounce the pursuit of identity on the basis of things which prove, in fact, very costly to ourselves and to our environment. And this is especially true in terms of the car, in terms of its effect on the environment. But all these things that in fact are in fact taking away our freedom at the same time that they are causing violence to the earth and to each other, and instead shape identities and shape a sense of security in a relationship with a God who is merciful and graceful, full of grace, so full of grace that there's no limit on this grace that God can supply to us. God will love us. God will take care of us. That's what the whole of the New Testament tells us about this God. This God is not angry at us. This God loves and cares about us and gives us grace that is abundant so that we don't have to worry about competing with each other for these false ways of shaping identity.
But when we actually look at the massive reality that the car presents in our culture, the way it shapes the aspirations of, our contemporaries, ourselves, our children, the way that what they desire and what they really want out of life, the way in which the car has shaped the geography, the very everyday business of life in our culture. Can the follower of Jesus really be free in this culture?
Well, that's a very difficult question, especially the way you put it when you start talking about our children. When you ask me, earlier in the show what I was driving. I should have said right now I'm driving a 1985 Nissan Stanza. I have a 15-year-old son who will very soon be driving, and I may no longer have that car. I mean, he may have that car. But when he talks about a car, he doesn't talk about that car. He talks about every car he sees. I mean, boy, that's a neat car. I wish I had that car. I wish I had this car. I think that if he's an example, it is extremely difficult to be free in this society.
I think it takes a sustaining community to nurture different visions of what freedom is and to practice that in very concrete ways, and probably to be very open about the idols we see around us, including the automobile or the other ways, false ways of shaping identity and attempting to secure freedom. Paul, in his day, talked about his old sense of identity and freedom in terms of his Jewish pedigree, as being circumcised on the 8th day. He's of the right tribe. He's a Pharisee. He's even a persecutor of the church in his previous existence. He's all these things that were the basis of his pride and identity before coming to Christ. And he says, well, that stuff doesn't matter. In fact, he has even harsher terms about to talk about how he looks upon that earlier means of shaping his identity. Instead, he says, well, what's important is to know Jesus Christ and to be in a relationship with him, so that it is then Jesus Christ who becomes the focal point of his identity. To nurture and sustain that sort of vision and to find ways to practice that kind of identity on a daily basis is, I think, not something that's very possible for individuals. I think it takes a community that is very intentional about that, and very careful and clear in its thinking about the ways our society, especially in this day of the power of the media, can seduce us as individuals or even as corporate bodies such as the church into false ways of shaping identity.
Right. I have to tell my son constantly that having this car or that car is not the most important thing in the world. Behind me, someone has to tell me constantly that having this book or that book isn't the most important thing in the world. Community is absolutely essential to this.
Well, it was Jesus Christ himself who promised that you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. My thanks to Stan Saunders and to Rick Dietrich for joining me to discuss this sign of the car. Thank you for joining us too. In the next program, we're going to be discussing the gun as a sign of the times. I hope you'll join us. Till then, goodbye.